I carried trays for half my life, blending into rooms where no one remembered my face. But that night, I wasn't serving strangers. I was at my own daughter's wedding. Her groom's smile hit a blade, each word sharper than the last I in front of everyone. He reduced me to nothing more than just a waiter. By the time the champagne glass hit the floor, they had no idea who they just insulted yet. The crystal stem of the glass was still trembling on the table when I felt the first wave of heat rise to my face. Conversations around us thinned into a low, awkward hum, the kind that fills a room when everyone knows a line has been crossed. My daughter's fingers clutched her bouquet a little tighter, her smile stiffening in that way children do when they're caught between love and loyalty. And there he was, the man she'd chosen, looking at me like I'd tracked mud across his marble floors. I had walked into this house with nothing but a gift in my hands and pride in my chest. The foyer, with its polished stone and cold perfection, had seemed like a place built to make people feel small. She had greeted me with warmth, but her eyes had flickered toward the box I carried. Inside it lay a timepiece older than her, a piece of our family's history, kept safe through years of struggle. I'd imagine her holding it on her wedding day, feeling connected to the people who had loved her long, before this man ever learned her name. When I placed it on the table, she lit up for a moment, but his glance barely skimmed over it. "Old," he said, as if its only value could be measured in currency. The word slid into my chest like a blade. I kept my voice level, swallowing down the urge to tell him what it had cost me, not in money, but in years of double shifts, missed holidays, and nights falling asleep in a chair because the rent was due. Dinner was served under the glow of chandeliers that caught every movement like the lens of a camera. The table sparkled with silver and crystal, but the air between us was heavier than lead. He spoke of guest lists and menus, of the kind of people he wanted around him on their special day. Investors, city figures, those whose handshakes could open doors. Then his gaze slid back to me and his smile thinned. "You work in a different circle," he said, as if I were a misplaced chair in his perfect arrangement. "You'd be out of place among them." My fork still midair, the room suddenly too quiet. My daughter tried to cut in, her voice strained, but he kept going, words sharpened to pierce. He spoke about reputation, about how this wasn't just a wedding but a showcase, how he couldn't afford for someone like me to be part of it. I felt my jaw tighten, but I didn't give him the satisfaction of seeing me break. "I raised her," I said quietly. "I worked every hour I could give her the life she deserved." His eyes didn't soften. Instead, he leaned back, almost amused. "And now she's stepping into a life far beyond what you could have imagined." The fork in my hand felt heavier than the watch in its box. I could feel the weight of every sacrifice pressing into my ribs. The voices around us blurred, replaced by the faint ticking of that watch in my mind. Each beat was a reminder, not a time lost, but of what I was willing to risk to stand where I belonged. He didn't know it yet, but that was the moment I decided. If he thought he could erase me from the day my daughter's life would change forever, he was about to learn exactly how wrong he was. The rest of the meal passed like a play I hadn't auditioned for. Each voice rehearsed, each smile rehearsed. Every glance toward me a reminder that I didn't belong on this stage. Forks scraped porcelain, glasses chimed, and somewhere between the laughter and the low hum of conversation, I felt myself vanish in their eyes. But inside, something was building, a slow tightening of the chest that comes before a man decides he's had enough. When we stepped out onto his terrace, the evening air was cool, but the ground felt uneven beneath me. From here, you could see his manicured gardens lit with strings of lights, rows of white chairs standing in perfect symmetry. I imagined my daughter walking that aisle without me there, her eyes searching the crowd and finding only strangers. He leaned against the railing like a king surveying land he'd conquered, his voice calm, almost friendly, as he spoke about costs, arrangements, and guest lists, as if money itself gave him the right to decide who deserved to witness her vows. I told him about the years I'd worked to give her an education, a safe home, and a future. He didn't blink. "That was then," he said, like the past meant nothing once he'd arrived. He spoke of his responsibility to her now, of the image they had to protect. The words weren't loud, but they cut deeper than any shouted insult. Every number he threw out, for flowers, for dresses, for the very chairs, was a price tag meant to measure the distance between his world and mine. By the time I stepped back inside, I'd already decided I wouldn't fight him with anger. I'd fight him with presence. The kind he couldn't erase. The kind that moved silently through a room and saw everything. I would be there when she walked down that aisle, whether he wanted me or not. I just wouldn't be sitting in a guest seat. That night, in the small quiet of my apartment, I set the watch on the table. Its ticking seemed louder than usual, like it was keeping count of something more important than minutes. I stare at my uniform hanging in the closet. Black vest, white shirt, polished shoes. For most of my life, it had been the outfit of invisibility. Tomorrow, it would be my ticket in. And as I reached for my phone to call in a favor, I felt a shift inside me. The moment a man stops asking for permission to stand where he belongs. The call went through on the second ring. Mateo's voice, warm and familiar, carried the sound of clinking glassware and a sizzling grill in the background. He'd owned the little Mediterranean place for as long as I'd been carrying trays, and we'd spent years trading shifts, favors, and quiet confidences between orders. I told him what had happened. Not every word, just enough for him to understand the weight behind my request. "You want to work tomorrow's event?" he asked, his tone flat with disbelief. "Your own daughter's wedding?" I leaned back in my chair, eyes locked on the watch gleaming under the lamplight. "It's the only way I'll be there." Silence followed, the kind that comes when someone measures the cost of loyalty. Then, with a heavy sigh, he said, "I'll call in favor." Morning came cold and restless. Sleep had been a stranger, replaced by a constant reel of what-ifs in my head. By the time I reached Mateo's restaurant, the air smelled of fresh bread and roasted peppers. He was waiting for me at the prep station, his weathered hands slicing onions in steady, practiced arcs. Without looking up, he slid a steaming mug of coffee toward me. I spoke to the catering lead. "You're on the crew." His eyes lifted, sharp now. "But once you step in there, you can't back down." Not from him, not from anyone. I nodded, though my throat felt tight. We both knew this wasn't about serving wine or clearing plates. It was about reclaiming ground I'd been pushed off of, the ground of being a father present at the moment his daughter's life would change. Mateo clapped a hand on my shoulder before turning back to his cutting board. "Wear the uniform. Keep your head down. And remember, sometimes the invisible man sees more than the king." That night, I laid the vest and bow tie across the bed, the watch resting neatly above them. I imagined the chairs being set, the flowers arranged, his voice telling people how perfect everything was. He thought I'd be miles away. Tomorrow, I'd be 3 feet from him, moving through his perfect world like a shadow he couldn't shake. And if he tried to erase me again, he'd learn that some shadows fight back. Dawn slipped into the blinds before I was ready for it. Thin stripes of light stretching across the uniform on my bed. I dressed slowly, buttoning the shirt with the same precision I'd used 1,000 times before, but today each motion felt heavier. The vest settled across my shoulders like a promise, the bow tie snug at my throat. I placed the watch in my pocket, its faint ticking a quiet reminder of why I was doing this. The estate came into view just after midday, its gates standing open for delivery vans and catering trucks. I walked in with the rest of the crew, a folded list in my hand, blending into the tide of black vests and white shirts. No one looked twice. To them, I was just another hired pair of hands. The ballroom was a hive of movement. Florists weaving ribbons, servers aligning glasses until they gleamed under the chandeliers. I moved among them, arranging cutlery, checking angles, knowing exactly how to disappear in plain sight. Then I heard her laugh. It cut through the bustle like sunlight breaking through storm clouds. She was standing near the head table, hair pinned back, cheeks flushed with pre-wedding nerves. My chest ached at the sight of her, but the warmth didn't last. He was there, too. His eyes found me almost instantly, recognition hardening into something darker. He crossed the room with calculated steps, stopping just short of my reach. "You really think this is clever?" he muttered, low enough that no one else could hear. "I'm here to work," I said, keeping my gaze on play settings. Nothing more. His lips curled into something between a smirk and a snarl. "You're not fooling anyone. You're forcing your way into a place you don't belong." I kept my voice level, even as my pulse hammered. I belong wherever my daughter is. His jaw flexed, but he didn't reply. Instead, he stepped back, eyes narrowing the way a man does when he's already planning his next move. The rest of the setup passed in a blur, every clink of silver and every folded napkin drawing me closer to the moment the first guest would arrive. I could feel the tension in the air, not just mine, but the unspoken battle hanging between us like an uncut wire. Somewhere in this perfect room, there was going to be a spark. And when it came, I knew exactly who would burn. By late afternoon, the ballroom had transformed into a scene out of magazine spread. Polished floors glowing like liquid amber, flower arrangements standing tall like silent sentinels, candles flickering in crystal holders that caught every breath of light. The soft murmur of staff conversations was soon replaced by the rustle of expensive fabrics and the clink of jewelry as the first guest began to arrive. I slipped into my rhythm, tray balanced effortlessly in one hand, the other ready to pour. To them, I was no one, and that was exactly the point. They came in waves. Politicians with watchful eyes, business magnates who shook hands like they were sealing deals, women whose gowns carried a hush of designer labels. Laughter rose and fell across the room like the tide. From the corner of my eye, I caught glimpses of my daughter, radiant, though her smile didn't quite reach her eyes, and of him, moving from guest to guest with the precision of a man curating an image. Every so often, his gaze flicked toward me, the muscles in his jaw tightening as if my very presence was a thread he couldn't pull out. Midway through the evening, I felt a shift. It was in the way he took the microphone, pausing just long enough for the room to fall into silence. He spoke with practiced warmth, his words painting a portrait of the people who mattered most to them. But as his tone changed, the edges sharpened, I knew where this was headed. Then came the pivot, his hand gesturing toward me across the room. And sometimes, he said, we're reminded that not everyone fits into the same world. Some remain in the role they were born into. The weight of every gaze turned my way. I stood still, tray in hand, the champagne glasses trembling only from the faint hum of the air conditioning. My daughter's eyes found mine, wide and pleading, but I didn't move. He went on, each sentence slicing deeper, turning my life into a cautionary tale in front of people I'd never met. The humiliation he wanted me to feel pressed at the edges of my chest. But I didn't let it in. Instead, I moved to a nearby table, poured champagne with the same steady hand I'd used all night, and asked the guests there if they'd like another glass. It caught him off guard. For a moment, his words faltered, the room holding its breath between us. He wanted a reaction, anger, embarrassment, retreat. But I wasn't giving him any of those. I was giving him composure, and in a room built on appearances, that was more dangerous to his image than any outburst could ever be. Still, I knew this wasn't the last play he'd make tonight. The look in his eyes said he had something else planned, and whatever it was, it would come soon. I drifted back toward the far side of the room, letting the hum of awkward conversation close over what had just happened. But I could feel it, the shift in the air, the curious glances guests now cast my way, the murmurs that trailed in my wake. His words had landed, yes, but they'd also planted a question. And in a room full of people addicted to answers, questions are dangerous things. It happened almost by accident. A young man near the bar, idly watching the muted television mounted above it, froze mid-sip. His gaze bounced from the screen to me. Back again, his expression slowly unraveling into something between disbelief and recognition. Then he said it, just loud enough to cut through the room's low chatter. That's him. Heads turned, curiosity igniting like kindling. I followed their eyes to the screen. There, in clean archival clarity, was a younger version of me. Crisp uniform, squared shoulders, voice carrying lines I hadn't spoken in decades. A scene from a film long buried under years of service shifts and rent payments. Suddenly alive in the middle of my daughter's wedding reception. The resemblance wasn't up for debate. Gasps rippled. Someone whispered my name. Phones appeared like drawn weapons. Guests scrolling, cross-checking, confirming. I didn't move. I just set my tray down, straightened my vest, and stood there while the reality settled in. The man serving their champagne had once been the man they'd paid to watch on the big screen. Across the room, I saw his face blanch, his carefully built tower of superiority tilting under the weight of something he couldn't control. I stepped forward, speaking just loud enough for the nearest tables to hear. Tonight isn't about me, and it wasn't. But the truth was already loose in the room, and there was no putting it back. They would talk. They would tell the story. And the man who tried to make me small was about to watch me become larger than he could have imagined. The murmur swelled into a low tide of voices. Each crest carried my name from one table to the next. I saw eyes light with recognition. Saw guests leaning into each other with hurried whispers, some pointing at the screen, others at me. The film clip played on, a younger version of myself delivering lines with the kind of conviction only youth and hunger can produce. It was strange, watching that man again, the man I had been, standing across the room from the man I had become. Across the hall, my daughter's expression shifted. At first, surprise, wide-eyed, mouth parted as she took in the footage. Then something deeper, heavier. She wasn't seeing an actor on a screen. She was seeing years I'd never spoken about, years I had set aside, so she could grow up without the uncertainty of the life I'd once chased. Her lips trembled, her bouquet lowering in her hands as though its weight had just doubled. And him, the man who had so confidently reduced me to just a help, he looked smaller. He stayed rooted at the head table, champagne glass hovering midair, his confident posture bleeding away inch by inch. The polished mask of control was cracking, the reality of his mistake written plainly in the pale set of his jaw. Guests began to rise from their seats, curiosity pulling them closer, some offering tentative handshakes, others murmuring their admiration for work they suddenly remembered vividly. I kept my voice steady, answering questions with brief nods, never letting the moment become a performance. Tonight belongs to my daughter, I told them again, though their eyes said they'd already decided otherwise. But even as the air shifted in my favor, I knew this wasn't over. His silence wasn't surrender. It was the pause of a man searching desperately for a way to regain the ground he'd just lost. And from the look in his eyes, whatever move he made next wasn't going to be subtle. He stood slowly, the scrape of his chair legs slicing through the low hum of conversation. The guests closest to him turned instinctively, sensing something was about to happen, the way people do before a storm breaks. He moved toward the microphone again, his steps deliberate, his eyes scanning the room, not in confidence this time, but in calculation. "I owe you all," he began, voice steady but stripped of its earlier arrogance. An acknowledgement. The word choice was careful, the tone crafted to sound sincere. But I could hear the strain under it, like a man walking on glass. He looked at me across the room, his hand tightening around the mic stand. Earlier tonight, I made a mistake. I let pride speak where humility should have stood. Some guests shifted, watching him the way one watches a gambler who's just lost a hand, but refuses to step away from a table. He continued, weaving apologies into compliments. Try to reframe the story, to place himself not as a villain, but as the man who had the grace to admit he'd been wrong. Every phrase was polished, every pause calculated, but his eyes betrayed him. They kept darting toward the clusters of guests still buzzing about what they'd seen on the television, the ones showing each other clips of me from decades ago. I stayed where I was, arms folded loosely, letting him talk. He wanted to reclaim the narrative, but the room's current had shifted, and he was swimming against it. My daughter watched from her place beside the head table, her gaze flicking between us. I could tell she heard the difference too, not just in his words, but in the way the room no longer belonged to him. When he finished, the applause was polite, but it lacked the warmth he'd been chasing. He'd regained a little dignity, perhaps, but not control. That was gone, and he knew it. His eyes met mine one last time before he stepped away from the mic, and in them, I didn't see victory or even peace. I saw the recognition of something he could never buy, outmaneuver, or erase. And I knew, before the night was over, he'd try one more time to take it from me. The music rose again, soft strings filling the air as servers glided between tables with plated entrees, but the atmosphere hadn't returned to what it was before. There was a shift now, a subtle reordering of gravity in the room. Conversation still buzzed of my name, my past, my choice to walk away from the spotlight, all things that made him grit his teeth behind his polite smile. He moved among the guests like a host should, but every time his eyes found me, I could see the calculation behind them, the quiet need to win back whatever ground he'd lost. I stayed in motion, tray in hand, offering wine refills, exchanging brief pleasantries. A few guests went out of their way to stop me, to shake my hand, to tell me which of my old films they'd loved. I thanked them, kept it brief, and moved on, not because I was uncomfortable, but because the more I deflected the attention, the more it clung to me. In a place built to worship status, I was standing as the one person in the room who didn't seem to need it. Across the dance floor, my daughter caught my eye. She mouthed something, "Thank you," and I could feel the lump rise in my throat. But before I could respond, I saw him lean in to whisper to one of the event managers, his expression tight, almost urgent. The manager's eyes flicked toward me, then quickly away, before disappearing toward the back exit. It was a small thing, but I'd been in enough rooms, served enough high-stakes dinners, to know when someone was setting a piece on the board. Whatever he'd just set in motion, it wasn't meant to be kind. My grip on the tray tightened. The night was far from over, and I could feel it. The quiet before a hit, the slow inhale before someone makes their move. Whatever was coming next, it was designed to push me out for good. From the corner of my eye, I caught movement near the service doors. 2 security staff weaving through the crowd, their earpieces glinting under the chandelier light. They weren't here earlier. Their posture told me everything. This wasn't about keeping guests safe. It was about removing someone quietly. And there was only one person in the room he'd want escorted out without a scene. They moved casually, too casually, pause and agree to guests, to adjust a tablecloth, but always getting closer to my position. I shifted slightly, stepping behind a tall arrangement of lilies, giving myself a moment to think. If they approached directly, I'd have to either walk out willingly or risk creating a disruption. Neither option was in my plan. Not tonight. One of the servers brushed past me, balancing a tray of desserts. Without hesitation, I swapped mine for hers, blending into the catering line headed toward the far side of the room. The timing was perfect. A round of applause broke out at the head table, all eyes momentarily turning toward the newlyweds. I slipped between the tables, my black vest indistinguishable from the rest of the staff, my movements fluid and unhurried. When I emerged near the back bar, I could see them, still scanning, still looking for me. But I also saw my daughter, laughing softly with a friend, unaware of what was unfolding in the periphery. That was when it hit me. If he was willing to have me physically removed tonight, he was willing to do worse tomorrow. This wasn't just about embarrassment anymore. This was about erasing me entirely from her wedding memories. I set the empty tray down, straightened my vest, and made a silent promise. He could send 100 men through that door, and I would still be standing here when she took the floor for her first dance. And if he tried to stop that, the whole room would see exactly what kind of man he really was. The band shifted to a slow melody, the kind meant to draw couples to the dance floor, but my focus stayed on the periphery. The 2 security men had changed tactics, no longer advancing straight toward me, but fanning out, scanning the staff as if they were looking for a needle in a haystack. Every so often, one of them would tap his earpiece, lips barely moving, their eyes tracking the room's pulse. I stayed fluid, moving between tables with the easy rhythm of someone who belonged there. Every refill, every polite nod, every quiet, "Enjoy your meal," made me just another shadow in the machine of service. Yet the tension kept building, because I knew they weren't going to give up. This wasn't a job for them anymore. It was an order from him. And men like that didn't like their orders ignored. Across the room, I caught sight of him speaking with a guest, a man in a tailored navy suit whose laugh could cut through the music. But even mid-conversation, he kept glancing my way, his smile not quite reaching his eyes. It wasn't joy on his face. It was the look of a chess player who believed he'd already anticipated my next move. I adjusted my position until I was near the side entrance to the kitchen. The smell of roasted herbs and citrus wafted out every time the door swung open, masking the faint click of my watch in my pocket. I was running through contingencies in my head, preparing for whatever came next, when I felt the change. It wasn't noise this time. It was silence. A sudden drop in the room's energy as the lights dimmed and the MC's voice rose over the speakers, calling for first dance. The entire crowd turned toward the center of the room, eyes on my daughter and her new husband. It was the moment everyone had been waiting for, and the perfect cover for them to make their move. My hand brushed the polished edge of a serving tray, my stance tightening. If they wanted to drag me out during her first dance, they have to do it in full view of every single person in this room. The spotlight caught them in the center of the floor. My daughter in white, her husband in his tailored suit, swaying to a song whose melody curled through the air like smoke. The guests circled in, their faces soft with admiration, their phones held high to capture the moment. And somewhere beyond that perfect ring of light, I could feel the security team tightening their approach, like wolves easing in on a target they thought couldn't run. I stepped to the edge of the crowd, close enough to see the way her hand rested on his shoulder, but far enough to keep the uniform's anonymity. My fingers brushed the watch in my pocket, its ticking syncing with the slow rhythm of their dance. I thought about every step it had taken to get me here. Every night I'd worked instead of sleeping, every tip I'd saved, every choice that had cost me pieces of myself, so she could have the life she deserved. One of the guards slipped through a gap in the onlookers, moving in behind me. The other cut across on the side, their timing practiced, their expressions neutral. They were good at this, invisible to anyone not looking for them. But I was looking. I'd been looking all night. I shifted my stance, not to run, but to stand exactly where I was, my back straight, my eyes fixed on the dance floor. Then she looked up, not at him, but at me, across all the faces, across the low golden haze of candlelight. Her eyes locked on mine. The music was swelling toward its chorus, but in that instant, the room felt completely still. She knew I was there. She knew I hadn't left. And in the small curve of her lips, barely a smile, more promise, I knew she understood everything. Behind me, I heard the subtle intake of breath from one of the guards, the faint shift of weight before they moved. My hand tightened on the tray. If they took one more step, the next scene wouldn't be theirs to control. The guard on my right made the first move. Not a grab. Not yet. Just a subtle step that closed the gap between us to a breast's length. His partner mirrored the motion on my left, boxing me into a narrow pocket of space where their hands could reach me in an instant. The music swelled. Strings stretching like pulled wire, masking the faint scuff of their shoes against the polished floor. I didn't flinch. I kept my gaze fixed on her. Her eyes hadn't left mine, even as she turned with her husband under the soft pool of light. Something passed between us in that unbroken stare, an understanding that neither of us had asked for, but both of us needed. The unspoken truth that no matter how carefully someone tried to curate this night, they couldn't write me out of it. The guard's hand twitched toward my elbow. I shifted my tray just enough to make him pause, the polished silver edge catching the reflection of the chandelier and flashing in his peripheral vision. That hesitation was all I needed. I angled myself toward a nearby table, stepping into the role I'd played all night. The quiet professional refilling glasses, invisible to everyone except the person whose drink I was pouring. The guests there smiled politely, oblivious of the tension vibrating inches away. But I felt his eyes on me, not the guards, the man who had orchestrated this. Across the floor, over the heads of his guests, he watched with a stillness that felt more dangerous than anger. He didn't look frustrated or surprised anymore. He looked patient, like someone who knew the game wasn't over. The song was nearing its end, the crowd tightening around the couple for their final turn. The guards didn't advance again, but they didn't back off either. They lingered close enough for me to hear the low murmur of their radios, close enough to remind me that they were waiting for a cue. And I knew it was coming. The moment the applause began, the music faded and the lights shifted. That would be his moment to strike. The final notes of the song lingered in the air like the last curl of smoke from a dying fire. Applause broke out, warm and sustained, the circle of guests closing around the couple in congratulations. The moment was perfect on the surface. Champagne flutes lifted, camera flashes catching smiles. But beneath it, the floor was shifting. I could feel it in the way the guards edged a fraction closer, in the almost imperceptible tilt of his head toward them from across the room. I didn't move. My tray was balanced against my palm, my posture loose, eyes drifting from one guest to the next as though nothing in the world demanded my attention more than keeping glasses full. Inside, my focus was razor sharp. Timing was everything now. If he wanted me removed without creating a scene, he'd have to strike while the energy of the room was still distracted, before the next toast, before the guests spread out again. My daughter was still near the center, speaking with her maid of honor, laughter tugging at the edges of her smile. She had no idea the undercurrent running through the crowd. I caught her glance once more, but I let it pass, not wanting to draw her into the tension. This was my fight, not hers. One of the guards shifted into my periphery, his expression unchanged, but his intent impossible to miss. I eased a step sideways toward a table of older guests, refilling 2 glasses, each pour deliberate, buying myself seconds. All the while, I kept him in my sight. The second guard hung back, clearly waiting for a signal, and then I saw it. The faintest nod from him at the head table, his fingers curling around the base of his glass like he was tightening a vise. That was the moment I knew the next move was coming, and it would happen fast. Whatever he was about to do, it wouldn't just decide the rest of this night. It would decide how this story was remembered. The nod was all it took. The nearer guard shifted his stance, hand lowering toward my arm, the movement hidden beneath the polite chaos of clinking glasses and congratulatory chatter. The second guard began closing in from behind, his shadow overlapping mine. They were counting on the noise, the crowd, the distraction of the moment to make me vanish without anyone noticing. But the thing about playing invisible for most of your life is that you learn how to turn visible in an instant. I stepped forward, not away from them, but toward the center of the room. The motion was smooth, unhurried, just a server delivering a bottle of champagne. But my angle cut between the guards and their approach, forcing them to break stride or risk shoving me into the nearest guest. My tray caught the light as I passed beneath the chandeliers, drawing the eyes of those around me. Enough eyes to make the men hesitate. When I reached the open space near the dance floor, I set the tray down on a passing table, removed the watch from my pocket, and held it in my palm. Its gold caught the soft glow of the candles, the ticking faint but steady. My daughter saw it first. Her hand flew to her mouth, eyes glistening as she understood. The crowd quieted without knowing why, their attention folding in toward the space where I now stood. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. This watch belonged to my father. I said, my words carrying in the hush, and his father before him. It has been present for every moment that mattered in my family's history. Tonight, I bring it here because this moment matters too. A ripple moved through the guests. The guard stopped entirely now, caught in the shift of the room's mood. He was watching from the head table, his grip on the glass so tight his knuckles whitened. I turned to my daughter. No man in this room has the power to decide if I belong here, because I already do. My place isn't given. It's earned, and I earned it the day you were born. The silence broke into applause, not the polite kind, but the rolling, genuine kind that fills a space with heat. Guests rose to their feet. Some clapped, some lifted their glasses, some simply nodded in quiet respect. My daughter crossed the floor, dress sweeping the polished wood, and threw her arms around me. The watch was between our hands, and for a moment, everything else faded. The guards, the tension, the man at the head table. But when I looked up over her shoulder, I saw his face. He wasn't beaten yet. No, now he was angry. And anger, in a man like him, meant the next move would be reckless. Her embrace lingered, warm and unshakable, but in the corner of my vision, his outline was rigid. A man holding himself together not out of dignity, but because he hadn't yet chosen his weapon. When she pulled back, the guests were still on their feet, the sound of applause spilling across the room in waves. But he didn't join in. He sat, shoulders locked, eyes fixed on me as if clapping would have been an admission he couldn't afford. The guard stepped back, no longer a threat, but I could tell they were waiting for his cue. Men like that don't quit. They just shift their tactics. I returned to my station near the edge of the floor, letting the crowd disperse back into its laughter and music. If he wanted to come at me again, he'd have to do it out in the open now. The band rolled into a livelier tune, guests filling the dance floor, some stealing glances at me between steps. It wasn't fame they were looking at. It was something else. They had seen me endure his public attempt to humiliate me, seen the quiet strength it took not to break, and that, I knew, had rewritten the story of the night more than anything on the program. But his eyes never softened, even when a guest leaned in to speak to him. Even when his new wife tugged lightly at his sleeve, he didn't take his gaze off me. It was the stare of a man calculating what it would cost to win, and deciding that no price was too high. Somewhere in that room, under all the music and the clinking glasses, a line had been drawn, and before the night ended, one of us was going to cross it. He stood. No warning. No microphone. Just the scrape of his chair and the sudden stillness it drew from those nearest to him. A few guests glanced over, their laughter faltering as they felt the tension coil in the air. He took a slow step toward me. Then another, weaving through the clusters of people with the deliberate pace of a man who wanted the entire room to watch. And they did. When he stopped in front of me, the music still played, but it might as well have been silent. His eyes were steady, his voice low but carrying. "I've been wrong before in my life," he said, "but I've never been more wrong than I was about you." The words were unexpected, too measured to be impulsive, too raw to be rehearsed. "I thought you'd be easy to remove, that your place in her life ended when mine began. But tonight, I saw something I can't compete with. I saw the man who made her who she is." The guards hung back, uncertain now, the script in their heads dissolving. The guests nearby leaned closer, sensing that the night had turned into something it was never meant to be. He extended his hand, not the stiff, polite handshake from earlier in the evening, but something else. Both hands open, palms forward, as if offering more than just a truce. I looked at them for a long moment, the watch still in my grip, the weight of it pressing into my palm. Then I set the watch down on the nearest table and took his hands. The pressure was firm, not overpowering, his eyes locked on mine. "I was afraid of you," he admitted quietly enough that only I could hear. "Afraid you'd outshine me, without even trying. Afraid she'd always measure me against you." I let him finish, then answered just as quietly, "The only measure that matters is how you treat her. You failed at, and nothing else counts." When we stepped back, the room didn't erupt into applause. It didn't need to. There was something heavier, richer in the air now. Respect, not just for me, but for the choice we both made in that moment. My daughter appeared between us, taking each of our hands and bringing them together, her eyes shimmering. "This is how I wanted tonight to end," she said, voice trembling. I didn't say it out loud, but I knew the truth. It wasn't the end. It was the start of a truce built on a fragile bridge, one we'd both have to guard. Still, as I walked her to the dance floor for our father-daughter dance, the watch secure in my pocket again, I knew one thing for certain. I hadn't just kept my place in her life. I had made sure the world knew it was mine all along.